They canceled her card at Christmas in front of everyone. Her own son stood there, silent. His wife smiled, and the family clapped as if it were normal. They saw her as old, dependent, done. But what they didn't realize was that the quiet woman at the table had spent decades building a life no one ever questioned. She didn't shout. She didn't break down. She simply smiled and asked one question that made the room go still. "You really don't know, do you?" And before I continue, if stories like these touch your heart, consider subscribing to Grandma Inspires. For more heartfelt confessions, please like this video and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next surprised everyone. What followed shattered a family illusion, unmasked control hiding behind love, and proved that silence can carry power, until the moment it finally speaks. Stay with me, because this Christmas dinner didn't just change her life. It revealed who she truly was. Everyone says Christmas is about family, but that night, Christmas became the day my own family buried me while smiling. The dining table looked perfect. Too perfect. The red tablecloth was neatly ironed, candles flickered softly, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the room like a carefully staged lie. Laughter bounced off the walls, glasses clinked, children ran around the living room, and music hummed quietly in the background. I sat at the head of the table, my chair, my house, and yet I had never felt more out of place. My name is Elena. I was 67 years old that night, a widow, a mother, a woman who had learned to survive quietly. I wore a deep burgundy shawl I had knitted myself years ago, the kind of thing people stop noticing once they decide you're old and irrelevant. Across from me sat my son, Daniel, my only child, the boy I raised alone after his father died. Beside him sat his wife, Lydia. She stood up slowly, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, the other lifting her glass. Her smile was practiced, confident, polished, the kind that assumes obedience before it's given. The room fell silent. "Family," she said brightly, tapping her glass. "I just want to say how grateful I am that we're all together tonight." Everyone smiled. Everyone leaned in. Daniel looked at her with pride, like she was about to announce something beautiful. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Lydia continued, "This year has changed everything for us. With the baby coming, Daniel and I realized it's time to make some responsible decisions." She paused, long enough for curiosity to bloom. "That's why," she said, glancing around the table, "starting today, I'll be handling all the important matters for this family. Finances, planning, organization. It's time for structure." A few approving nods. A soft laugh from someone near the kitchen. Then she turned to me. "Elena," she said sweetly, "we've already taken the first step. Your credit card was canceled this morning." The room didn't react at first. Then came the applause. Soft, polite, encouraging. Someone said, "That's actually very smart." Another added, "At her age, it's safer." Daniel nodded. "It's for your own good, Mom. You won't have to worry anymore." Worry. I stared at my son, the same boy who once cried because I worked late nights. The same boy who promised he'd never let me struggle again. And there he was, smiling as if he'd just solved a problem. As if I was the problem. Lydia leaned closer. "If you need anything," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound kind, "you can always ask us in advance. Ask. Permission. For my own life." I took a slow sip of my drink. The taste was bitter, but I didn't flinch. I noticed how everyone avoided my eyes, how no one defended me, how comfortable they looked watching me shrink. Then I smiled. Not a sad smile, not a broken one, a calm smile. I placed my glass down. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Daniel looked at me, confused. "Mom?" I stood up slowly, feeling every year in my knees, and met his eyes. "Son," I said gently. You really don't know, do you? His smile froze. Lydia's fingers tightened around her glass. And in that silence, I knew something important. They believed I was finished. They believed I had nothing left. And that mistake was about to cost them everything. Because the woman they humiliated that night wasn't weak, and what they didn't know would change all their lives by morning. Daniel didn't answer my question. He just stared at me, blinking like someone who had missed a step in a familiar staircase. Lydia's confident smile wavered, only for a second, but I saw it. I had spent a lifetime reading people without them realizing it. "Know what?" Lydia asked quickly, forcing a laugh. "Mom, you're being dramatic. We're just trying to help." Help, that word again. I didn't respond. I simply sat back down, folded my hands on my lap, and let the noise return to the room. Someone turned the music up, plates clinked. Conversations resumed, louder than before, as if everyone needed to drown out the discomfort my question had created. Daniel leaned toward me. "Mom, please don't make this awkward." I almost laughed. Awkward? Not cruel, not humiliating, just awkward. I nodded once. "Of course, my son." That seemed to satisfy him. He turned back to Lydia, who was already basking in praise again, her announcement now framed as responsible, modern, and necessary. No one noticed when I stopped eating. As I watched them celebrate my erasure, my mind drifted not to anger, but to memory. 40 years earlier, silence had saved me. I was 28 when my husband died. A sudden accident. A phone call that split my life in two. I remember standing in our small living room, staring at the wall while Daniel slept in his crib, unaware that his world had already collapsed. People think grief is loud, crying, screaming, breaking things. Mine was quiet. I learned early that survival often hides behind silence. After the funeral, the bills came. Then the sympathy dried up. Friends stopped visiting. Offers of help faded. And I understood something important. No one was coming to save me. So I saved myself. I sowed first to survive, then to grow, then to build. But I never told Daniel. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted him to become strong. I wanted my son to believe effort mattered. That money didn't fall from the sky. That comfort had to be earned. So I let him believe his mother struggled. I let him believe the old sewing machine was my only lifeline. And for years, that lie protected us both. Until it didn't. Back at the table, Lydia laughed loudly, her hand resting possessively on Daniel's arm. She spoke about budgets, about plans, about how older people sometimes don't realize when they need help. Each sentence landed like a quiet slap. I glanced around the room. My sisters-in-law nodded along. My nephews avoided my eyes. Even the children seemed to sense something was wrong and stayed unusually quiet. I realized then that humiliation isn't always violent. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it wears a smile and calls it self-care. Daniel finally looked at me again. "You're okay, right, Mom?" I met his gaze. "I'm fine." And that was the truth. Because while they believed they had taken control, nothing of value had actually changed. The card they canceled? A shadow account. The house they thought defined me? Only one piece of a much larger picture. They saw a dependent old woman. They didn't see the years of discipline, the quiet accumulation, the decisions made in solitude. They didn't see me. Dinner ended shortly after. Coats were put on. Hugs were exchanged. Lydia kissed my cheek lightly and whispered, "You'll thank us one day." I smiled again. Daniel walked me to the door. "I hope you understand, Mom. We're just doing what's best." "For who?" I asked softly. He hesitated, then said, "For everyone." The door closed behind me. Outside, the night air was cold. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and walked to the taxi waiting at the curb. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the house glowing with warm lights and false unity. That was the moment I decided. I would stop being silent, not out of revenge, but out of truth. Because when people mistake your kindness for weakness long enough, they eventually force you to remind them who you really are. And Christmas was only the beginning. Because what they believed was my surrender was actually my preparation, and the past I buried in silence was about to return. Silence has a sound when you live inside it long enough. It's the ticking of a clock in an empty room, the hum of a sewing machine late at night, the soft breath of a sleeping child who depends on you completely. That was my life after Daniel's father died. I didn't cry the day we buried him, not because I didn't love him, but because grief had already drained me dry. I was 7 months pregnant, dressed in borrowed black, standing beside a grave that felt deeper than the earth itself. When the last person walked away, I stood there alone and understood something terrifying. From that moment on, everything depended on me. 2 weeks later, the knocks began. Landlord, utility company, a man with papers I didn't understand, but numbers I did, debt. I sat on the kitchen floor that night, my back against the cabinet, one hand on my swollen belly, and whispered an apology to the child inside me. I didn't know how I would protect him, but I promised that I would. The next morning, I didn't wait for help. I pulled out my old sewing machine, the one my mother had given me years earlier, the one that rattled too loudly and jammed if you weren't patient. I started small, fixing hems, mending jackets, altering dresses for neighbors who paid in cash and gratitude. I worked while Daniel slept. I worked while he cried. I worked through exhaustion so deep it felt physical. But something strange happened. I wasn't just surviving. I was learning. I learned how to price my work, how to say no, how to save instead of spend. And when an opportunity came, a woman who needed custom work for an event, I didn't hesitate. I showed up early. I delivered perfection. I charged fairly, not cheaply. She recommended me to another woman, then another. Soon, my little kitchen became too small. I rented a tiny workspace downtown, bare walls, flickering lights, no sign on the door. I didn't want attention. Attention brings questions, and questions bring expectations. I stayed invisible on purpose. Years passed that way. Daniel grew. He went to school in clean but mended clothes. He never went hungry, but he never saw excess either. I wanted him grounded, hungry enough to dream, strong enough to work. When he asked if we were poor, I told him we were careful. And that wasn't a lie. What I never told him was how careful. I reinvested everything, every extra dollar. I learned which neighborhoods were rising, which properties were undervalued, which risks were worth taking. I listened more than I spoke. I let people underestimate me. It was useful. By the time Daniel was in college, I owned more than fabric and thread. I owned time, security, options. But I still lived the same way. Same modest house, same old furniture, same quiet routines. People think that means you have nothing. They're wrong. It means you don't need to prove anything. Daniel graduated, got a good job, told me proudly that he would take care of me now. I hugged him, smiled, and told him I didn't need much. That was true. What I needed most was peace. And for a long time, I had it. Until Lydia entered our lives. She arrived with confidence and Polish, with words that sounded educated and plans that sounded smart. Daniel was dazzled. He mistook ambition for stability and charm for kindness. I noticed the details he didn't. How her eyes measured rooms. How her compliments always came with conditions. How she spoke about managing people as if they were resources. Still, I said nothing, because silence had protected me before. But silence, I would soon learn, becomes dangerous when the wrong person fills it with their own story. And Lydia had already begun writing mine. Because while I was busy disappearing to survive, someone else was learning how to erase me, and she was just getting started. When Lydia first came to my house, she smiled the way people do when they've already decided who you are. She arrived 10 minutes early, on purpose. People like her always do. They want to see you unprepared, to measure your life before you've had time to arrange it. I was in the kitchen, flour on my hands, the oven warm with bread baking. Daniel opened the door, beaming like a boy bringing home a prize. "Mom, this is Lydia." She extended her hand. Her grip was brief, light, almost symbolic. Her eyes moved quickly. Walls, furniture, floor, ceiling, a silent inventory. "This is cozy," she said. "Not warm, not lovely, cozy." We sat down to eat. Daniel talked excitedly about work, about future plans, about how motivated Lydia was. She nodded, added comments at the right moments, asked questions that made her sound thoughtful without revealing much. I listened. When I asked about her family, her answers were polished but vague. When I asked about her work, she used impressive words but avoided specifics. When she laughed, it was controlled, like she was always aware of how she looked while doing it. Experience had taught me something important. People who talk too much about success are usually still chasing it. After dinner, she helped clear the table, but only just enough to be noticed. "Daniel tells me you've done everything for him alone," she said casually. "That must have been difficult." It was a statement disguised as sympathy. "I did what was necessary," I replied. She smiled again. "Of course. But it's good he doesn't have to struggle anymore." Something about the way she said struggle stayed with me. Over the next months, Daniel changed. Not all at once. Quietly. He visited less. He spoke more about appearances. How important it was to look professional, to move up. He started worrying about things he'd never worried about before. Status. Image. Perception. Lydia never demanded. She suggested. And suggestions are far more dangerous. "She's just worried about you, Mom. She just wants what's best. She says we need to think long term." Every sentence began with "she says." I watched my son slowly hand over his certainty, piece by piece. One afternoon, Lydia came alone. That was new. She sat across from me, legs crossed, hands folded carefully in her lap. "I want us to have a good relationship," she began. "You're very important to Daniel." Important. The word hovered between us, heavy with implication. "I know change is hard," she continued, "especially at your stage of life. My stage of life. I just want you to know," she said gently, "that Daniel and I will take care of everything from now on. You don't need to worry anymore." I met her eyes. "I've been taking care of myself for a very long time," I said calmly. Her smile tightened. "Of course," she replied. "But eventually everyone needs help." That was the moment I understood. She didn't see me as a person. She saw me as a transition, an obstacle between her and total control. After she left, I sat alone at the table long after the tea went cold. For the first time in years, I opened the small safe hidden behind a loose panel in the hallway. Inside were documents no one else had ever seen. Proof. Ownership. Years of quiet discipline. I closed it again without taking anything out. Not yet. Because Lydia believed power was something you announced. I knew better. Real power waits and waits, and lets others expose themselves first. Because the more she tried to take care of me, the clearer it became she wasn't planning to help. She was planning to replace me. The first time Daniel suggested I needed help managing my life, I almost laughed. Almost. We were sitting in my living room, the same room where he had done homework on the floor, where I had rocked him through fevers and nightmares. He held a mug of coffee with both hands, staring into it like the answers might float to the surface. "Mom," he began carefully, "Lydia and I have been talking." "Of course you have," I thought. "She's just worried about you," he continued. "You're alone here most of the time. What if something happens? What if you fall?" Or forget to pay a bill. Forget. The word stung more than I expected. I've managed just fine for decades, I replied evenly. I know, he said quickly, but you're getting older. It's normal to need support. Support. That was the new word now. I studied my son's face. He looked sincere, tired, conflicted. I could see the boy I raised buried under layers of responsibility and someone else's influence. Daniel, I said gently, needing help and being controlled are not the same thing. He frowned. No one wants to control you. But even as he said it, he couldn't meet my eyes. Soon after, the suggestions escalated. Lydia sent Daniel articles about senior safety, about fraud, about memory decline, about how adult children should step in before it's too late. Concern, wrapped in fear, tied neatly with logic. One Saturday, they arrived together carrying a bright folder. We brought this to help you organize your documents, Lydia said cheerfully. Deeds, bank papers, medical records. Daniel should know where everything is in case of an emergency. Emergency. I smiled politely. Everything important is already organized. But where? She pressed. It's better if we all know. I shook my head. When it's necessary, I'll say so. The air shifted. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Lydia's smile faltered just slightly. That night, I realized something important. Every boundary I set made her more determined to cross it. The real change came after she got pregnant. Suddenly, everything was urgent. Think about the baby, she said often. Think about the future. Think about what you'll leave behind. One afternoon, she said it plainly. This house is really too much for you, she remarked, glancing around. It would make sense to sell it. Daniel could use the money, especially now. I didn't answer right away. This house isn't for sale, I said finally. She tilted her head. Of course, I just meant, eventually, when you're gone, it will belong to Daniel anyway. She said it casually, like discussing the weather. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood the shape of her plan. She wasn't waiting for me to fail. She was preparing for my disappearance. A month later, Daniel arrived with papers. He looked nervous. We spoke to a lawyer, he said, just to make sure everything's in order. In order for what? I asked. For the future, he replied. The lawyer thinks it would be safer if the house was transferred to my name now. It avoids complications later. Later. Death, wrapped in paperwork. I read the documents carefully, very carefully. They weren't illegal. They weren't aggressive. They were simply convenient for them. I looked at my son. Do you believe I can't handle my own affairs? He hesitated. Just long enough. I think, he said slowly, that Lydia is right. You're stubborn, and that worries me. That word, stubborn, cut deeper than anger ever could. But I didn't argue. I signed. Because what Daniel didn't know, what Lydia never imagined, was that this house was the smallest piece of my life, the least valuable, a decoy they believed was the prize. Sometimes, the smartest move is letting people think they've won. Because once they believe that, they stop being careful. And Lydia was about to make her biggest mistake because she thought the game was over, when in truth, it had only just begun. After I signed those papers, everything changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but subtly, like the way a room feels different once someone believes it belongs to them. Daniel became calmer, lighter, as if a burden had lifted from his shoulders. He hugged me more often, spoke with reassurance in his voice, and repeated the same sentence whenever doubt crept in. This is for your own good, Mom. Lydia, on the other hand, stopped pretending. She no longer asked. She informed. She spoke to me slowly now, carefully, like someone explaining something to a child. She reminded me about appointments I never missed, corrected stories I remembered perfectly, and praised me for handling things so well. Praise can be a weapon when it's undeserved. One afternoon, I went to withdraw money from my personal account, the small one I used for daily expenses. The machine rejected my card. I tried again. Same message. Inside the bank, a young clerk reviewed the screen and smiled politely. Your card was canceled last week at the request of the authorized family contact. Who? I asked, though I already knew. Your son. I walked out without saying another word. When I called Daniel, his voice was rushed. Mom, wait, Lydia read something about scams targeting seniors. We thought it was safer this way. So, now I need permission to use my own money? I asked quietly. It's not like that, he replied. If you need anything, just tell us. Tell us. Like a child asking for allowance. That night, I didn't cry. I unlocked the safe. For the first time in years, I spread everything across the dining table. Property deeds, lease agreements, investment statements, accounts in my name, and only my name. What Daniel believed was my entire life was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. I had built my security quietly, methodically, and intentionally outside his view. And now that illusion had become dangerous, not because of money, because of dignity. The next weeks were a slow parade of small humiliations. Lydia began scheduling my visits, corrected me in front of others, offered me non-alcoholic drinks for my age. At a family gathering, she placed me in a corner chair and warned me not to stain the furniture. She laughed when she said it. No one laughed with her. They laughed at me. Daniel noticed none of it. Or worse, noticed and chose comfort over confrontation. The final straw came quietly. I was standing in my kitchen one morning when the phone rang. It was Lydia. I just wanted to let you know, she said brightly, that moving forward, I'll be handling all financial decisions for the family. It's easier that way, including me. She didn't say it, but she didn't have to. I hung up the phone and sat down slowly. For years, I had stayed silent to protect my son. Now, my silence was teaching him the wrong lesson. That I was weak. That I was dependent. That I had nothing. And worst of all, that it was acceptable to erase me. That afternoon, I made a decision. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would not accuse. I would reveal. But only once. And only when it mattered. I called my accountant. I need you to prepare everything, I said. Every document, every proof. I want it ready. He paused. This will change things. Yes, I replied calmly. That's the point. When I hung up, I looked around my modest kitchen. The same walls, the same table, the same quiet. They thought this was all I was, and soon they would learn how wrong they were. Because Christmas was coming, and I had chosen the night they planned to celebrate my control, to show them my freedom. Once Lydia believed she was in control, she stopped hiding her intentions. That's the thing about power, it makes careless people reckless. The invitations stopped coming directly to me. Instead, I'd hear about family dinners after they happened. Daniel would call casually and say, "Oh, we thought you might be tired," or "Lydia didn't want to disturb you." Disturb, as if my presence was noise. When I did visit, the rules had changed. Shoes off at the door. Sit here, not there. Careful with that, it's expensive. Lydia watched me constantly, correcting me with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. She spoke about me when I was in the room as if I wasn't. Older people can be sensitive, she told her friends once. You have to guide them gently. Gently. Daniel nodded along, unaware that every nod pushed me further into the shadows. The worst part wasn't Lydia. It was my son's silence. He had become a man who avoided conflict at any cost. If Lydia dismissed me, he changed the subject. If she spoke over me, he pretended not to notice. And when I tried to speak privately with him, he always seemed exhausted, distracted, already half gone. One evening, I arrived unannounced, something I used to do freely. Lydia opened the door and blocked the entrance with her body. "Oh!" she said, surprised but not pleased. We weren't expecting you. I brought food, I replied, holding up the container. She glanced at it like it was an inconvenience. Next time, please call first. We're trying to establish routines. Routines. Daniel appeared behind her, guilt flickering across his face. Mom, maybe it's better if we plan visits. Plan visits? I nodded. Of course. I turned and walked away before either of them could see my hands shaking. That night, I realized something painful. They weren't pushing me out suddenly. They were letting me fade. Then came the financial humiliation. Lydia invited me to go shopping for the baby. I thought foolishly that it was an olive branch. At the store, she selected items without looking at prices. When the total was announced, she turned to me expectantly. I reached into my purse and placed what I had on the counter. Her smile disappeared. That's all? She asked, not bothering to lower her voice. I didn't know we were buying so much, I said calmly. She laughed. It's fine. Michael will pay. She used his credit card like it was her own, and in many ways it was. As we walked out, she leaned close and whispered, I guess we shouldn't expect too much from you. That night, I cried, not because of money, because of what she was teaching my son about me. At the next family gathering, Lydia seated me away from everyone else. When dessert was served, my homemade cake stayed untouched while a store-bought one took center stage. No one noticed. Or worse, they noticed and said nothing. I left early. No one stopped me. The following week, Daniel called. Mom, he said carefully, Lydia thinks it might be better if we handle things for you from now on, just until things stabilize. Stabilize? I asked. With the baby coming, there's a lot going on. There it was. The final justification. I ended the call politely and sat in silence for a long time. They thought they were managing my decline. They didn't realize they were witnessing my awakening. Because once someone takes your dignity, you either disappear completely or you stand up in a way no one expects. And I was done disappearing. Because Lydia believed. I was fading quietly, but she didn't know I was preparing the moment that would expose everything she built on lies. The night my bank card was canceled, something inside me finally went still. Not numb, not broken, clear. For years, I had adjusted, softened my voice, stepped back, let things slide in the name of peace. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was patience. But patience, when abused long enough, turns into permission. And I had given them far too much. I stood in my kitchen that night, the house quiet except for the ticking clock above the sink. The same clock Daniel had broken once as a child and cried over because he thought I'd be angry. I hadn't been. I'd hugged him and told him some things could be fixed. This wasn't one of those things. I took the folder from the safe again and laid everything out neatly. Not in anger, with intention. Every document told a story they didn't know. Every signature carried years of discipline. Every number was proof of something I'd earned without applause. For the first time, I asked myself a hard question. Why am I still hiding? The answer was uncomfortable, because I was afraid. Not of Lydia, but of losing my son. I had spent so long protecting Daniel from struggle that I'd forgotten to protect myself from him. The next morning, Lydia called. Mother, she said, she'd started calling me that now. Formal and distant. We're going to need you to inform us before any financial decisions you make. I closed my eyes slowly. I don't make decisions without consulting family, she continued. It's safer. Safer. No, I said. There was a pause. Excuse me? No, I repeated, clearly. I won't be doing that. Silence stretched between us. That's not reasonable, she said finally. Daniel agrees. That's unfortunate, I replied, because this conversation ends here. I hung up before she could respond. My hands trembled, but I didn't regret it. That afternoon, I went to the bank and restored access to my accounts. All of them. I updated permissions. I removed names. I locked doors that should never have been opened. The clerk asked if I wanted to notify my family. No, I said. They'll find out when they need to. The first message from Daniel came that evening. Mom, Lydia says you were upset on the phone. I stared at the screen. I'm not upset, I typed back. I'm done being managed. He didn't reply for a long time. When he finally did, it was short. We're just trying to help. That sentence again. Help without consent. Help without respect. Control disguised as care. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I let silence speak for me for once. Over the next days, Lydia grew restless. She called less, texted more, asked questions that weren't really questions. Did you go out today? Did you speak to anyone at the bank? Are you feeling all right? I answered politely. Vaguely. She was losing her grip and she felt it. Then Daniel came over unannounced. He looked tired, defensive, like someone caught between loyalty and truth. Mom, he said, sitting down heavily, why are you making this difficult? I looked at him, really looked. Because you made it necessary, I replied softly. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. I continued, you don't get to take my independence and call it love. He rubbed his face. You don't understand the pressure Lydia's under, and you don't understand what you've taken from me, I said. That was the first honest conversation we'd had in months, and it scared him. Good, because fear, unlike comfort, makes people listen. I watched him leave without hugging me, without resolving anything. That was fine, because I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was preparing for truth. And when truth arrives, it doesn't ask either. Because the closer Christmas came, the more desperate Lydia became, and desperation makes people careless. Lydia had always believed control was something you tightened slowly. What she didn't understand was that when control starts slipping, people panic, and panic makes mistakes. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, her tone changed. She stopped pretending to be gentle and started becoming efficient. Calls became instructions. Messages became reminders. And Daniel, tired, overwhelmed, and afraid of conflict, became the messenger she hid behind. She just wants clarity, he told me. She's under stress. Please don't take it personally. But it was personal, because clarity, in Lydia's language, meant compliance. One afternoon, she showed up at my door without calling. I noticed immediately how she stood shoulders back, chin lifted, already prepared for resistance. We need to talk, she said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. I didn't stop her. She sat down like she owned the place. Daniel is worried, she began. Your behavior lately has been unpredictable. Unpredictable. I folded my hands calmly. In what way? You've been making decisions without informing us, changing arrangements, withdrawing money. I smiled faintly. It's my money. Her eyes hardened. That's not how families work. That's exactly how they work, I replied. Or at least how healthy ones do. She inhaled sharply. You're being emotional. There it was. The oldest dismissal in the book. I'm being clear, I said. There's a difference. She stood up abruptly. If you continue like this, you're going to force us to take steps we don't want to take. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Such as? I asked. She hesitated just long enough. Protective ones. I nodded slowly. Do what you think is best. That confused her. She expected fear, resistance, pleading. She got none. From that moment on, Lydia accelerated her plan. She spoke openly about managing family finances at gatherings, corrected me publicly, told people she was handling everything now because it was too much for me. And people believed her, because confidence convinces when silence doesn't argue back. The invitation to Christmas dinner arrived shortly after. Daniel called, his voice tense. Lydia wants everyone together this year. She thinks it'll be good. Good for who? I asked. For the family, he replied automatically. I agreed to come, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I understood something Lydia didn't. People who believe they've already won love to celebrate early. And celebrations make people careless. The night before Christmas, I barely slept. It's not from anxiety, but anticipation. I went over every detail carefully, every document, every sequence, every word I might need to say, and those I would not. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to accuse. I was going to let truth speak for itself. Christmas morning arrived quietly. I dressed simply. Nothing that suggested wealth. Nothing that warned of what was coming. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and looked at myself in the mirror. They would see exactly what they expected. A harmless old woman, dependent, grateful. The best disguises are the ones people choose for you. When I arrived at Daniel's house, the atmosphere was festive. Music played, food filled the air. Lydia greeted guests like a host who believed she was in charge. When she saw me, she smiled with satisfaction. "Good," she said softly. "You came." As if attendance was optional for me. As if this wasn't my son's home. I took my seat at the edge of the room and waited, because Lydia had prepared a speech. And speeches are dangerous things, especially when you don't know who's listening or what they're holding back. Because when Lydia stood to raise her glass that night, she had no idea the toast she prepared would destroy the illusion she built so carefully. The house was full, but I had never felt more alone. Laughter bounced off the walls, wine glasses clinked, and conversations overlapped in a way that made everything feel loud without meaning. Children ran past my chair. Someone turned the music up. The smell of food hung heavy in the air. I sat quietly where Lydia had placed me, slightly away from the center, close enough to be seen, far enough to be ignored. She was radiant that night. Her dress hugged her pregnant belly perfectly. Her hair fell in soft waves. She moved through the room like someone who believed this moment belonged to her, and in her mind, it did. Every few minutes, she glanced at me, checking, measuring, making sure I stayed small. Daniel avoided my eyes. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he kept adjusting his sleeves, the way he laughed too quickly at jokes that weren't funny. He knew something was off, but he didn't know what. Dinner was served. My portion was smaller than everyone else's. No one commented. No one objected. Lydia smiled as if she were doing me a favor. "At your age, you shouldn't eat too much," she said lightly. I nodded. Of course. Inside, something hardened. When plates were cleared and glasses refilled, Lydia stood. She tapped her glass with a spoon. The sound cut through the room like a blade. "Family," she began, her voice confident, rehearsed. "I just want to say how grateful I am that we're all together tonight." People smiled. Heads turned toward her. "With the baby coming," she continued, "Daniel and I have had to think seriously about responsibility, about structure, about making sure everyone is taken care of." She paused. I could feel it. The moment she'd been waiting for. "That's why," she said proudly, "we've decided to centralize things. From now on, I'll be managing all financial matters for the family." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. "Especially," she added, turning toward me, "when it comes to Alina. My name landed heavy. As you know," Lydia said smoothly, "her card was canceled recently. At her stage of life, it's simply safer this way." Someone nodded. Someone clapped softly. Daniel cleared his throat. "It's for your own good, Mom." The room waited. For tears. For embarrassment. For submission. I stood. Slowly. The chair scraped lightly against the floor, and the sound seemed louder than the applause had been. I felt every eye turn toward me. Lydia's smile widened. She thought she'd won. I smiled back. Not weak, not angry, calm. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. "Daniel," I said gently, "you truly don't know, do you?" The room froze. The music seemed to fade. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped when no one joined in. Lydia frowned. "Know what?" I didn't answer immediately. Silence is powerful when you're no longer afraid of it. I reached into my handbag and placed my phone on the table. "I was waiting for the right moment," I said softly. "And you just gave it to me." Daniel's face drained of color. Lydia's fingers tightened around her glass, because for the first time that night, they realized something was wrong. They had planned this moment carefully. What they hadn't planned for was me being ready. Because the next thing I did would expose every lie they believed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after my words was unbearable. Not awkward. Dangerous. Daniel stared at me as if he were seeing a stranger. Lydia's confidence flickered, then hardened, like glass under pressure. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "what are you talking about?" I picked up my phone, tapped the screen once, and placed it back on the table. "I'm talking about the mistake you both made," I replied calmly, "assuming you knew my life, without ever asking." Lydia laughed lightly. "Elena, this really isn't the time for drama. Drama. A word people use when truth makes them uncomfortable. This isn't drama," I said. "This is clarity." I turned to the room, to the relatives who had applauded, to the ones who had looked away, to the ones who believed silence meant agreement. "For years," I continued, "I allowed everyone to believe I was struggling, that I depended on others, that I had little to my name." Daniel swallowed hard. "That was my choice," I said. "Not because it was true, but because it protected my son while he was becoming his own man." Lydia's smile was gone now, completely. "Mom," Daniel interrupted, "what does this have to do with tonight?" "Everything." I reached into my handbag and pulled out a single envelope. "This," I said, placing it beside my phone, "is why canceling my card didn't hurt me." The room leaned forward. Lydia's eyes darted to Daniel. "What is this?" "An overview," I replied, "prepared by my accountant." I let the words sink in. "Accountant?" someone whispered. Daniel shook his head slowly. "You don't have." "I do," I said softly. "And I always have." I slid the envelope toward him. He opened it with trembling hands. I didn't need to say what was inside. I watched his face change as he read confusion melting into disbelief, disbelief into something close to fear. "That's not possible," Lydia said sharply, standing. "This must be some misunderstanding." I met her eyes. "No. What you're feeling right now is the collapse of an assumption." Daniel looked up. "Mom, what is this?" "It's a summary," I replied, "of what I built quietly while raising you alone. Properties, investments, income streams, all legally mine." A gasp rippled through the room. Lydia snatched the paper from Daniel's hands and skimmed it rapidly. Her face went pale. This has to be wrong," she said. "You never lived like it?" I finished for her. "That was intentional." I turned back to Daniel. "I didn't want money to raise you," I said gently. "I wanted values too." Tears welled in his eyes. "You let me believe you needed help," he whispered. "I let you believe I trusted you to respect me," I replied. That hurt him more than anger ever could. Lydia slammed the paper back onto the table. "This doesn't change anything. We were still right to protect you. Protect me. From my own success." I smiled sadly. "You weren't protecting me, Lydia. You were positioning yourself." The room was silent again, because everyone could see it now. Not just the money, the manipulation, the arrogance, the entitlement. And Lydia knew it. Because the next question wasn't how much I owned, but why I would never let them touch any of it. Daniel was still holding the envelope when he finally looked at me again. Not as a son, not as a child seeking approval, but as a man realizing he had been terribly wrong. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Didn't you ever tell me?" The room seemed to shrink around us. Lydia crossed her arms. She had retreated into herself now, watching carefully, calculating damage, already planning her next move. I answered my son honestly. Because I wanted you to become strong without leaning on me, I said. I wanted you to build your life without expecting inheritance or rescue, and you did. Daniel nodded slowly. But I thought you needed us. I smiled gently. I needed respect. That was when Lydia spoke again. So all of this, she said sharply, was some kind of test? No, I replied. It was life. She scoffed. Convenient timing, revealing everything when it suits you. I turned to face her fully. I revealed it when my dignity was taken, I said. There's a difference. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. I canceled your card, he whispered. I spoke to a lawyer about your house. I believed you couldn't manage anymore. He looked up, eyes wet. I treated you like a burden. I reached out and placed my hand over his. You treated me like someone you didn't know, I corrected softly. The difference mattered. Lydia stepped forward. You can't blame him. I was just trying to protect our future. The baby's future. There it was. The final justification. I understand fear, I said. I lived with it for decades. But fear doesn't excuse control. She opened her mouth to argue. I didn't let her. Let me be clear, I continued calmly. None of my assets are accessible to anyone but me. Not now, not ever. Daniel looked stunned. Mom, I love you, I said quickly. But love doesn't mean surrender. The room erupted into murmurs. Someone asked, then what happens now? I answered without hesitation. Now, I live my life without permission. I turned back to Daniel. You're my son. That will never change. But the relationship we had where you made decisions for me, that ends tonight. He nodded, tears falling freely now. I'm sorry, he said, and this time I believed him. Lydia was silent, defeated, but not remorseful. As people began to gather their coats, the mood heavy and uncomfortable, she leaned toward me and whispered, You didn't have to humiliate us. I met her gaze evenly. You humiliated yourself, I said. I only stopped protecting the illusion. She stepped back as if struck. When I walked out into the cold night air, I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. Lightness. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking, I wasn't explaining, I wasn't apologizing. I was simply standing. But what Lydia did next, after the guests left, proved that losing control was something she would never accept quietly. The guests left quietly. No laughter. No lingering conversations. Just coats, lowered eyes, and doors closing faster than usual. Christmas night ended without carols. Daniel stood near the window, staring out into the dark street, his reflection fractured by the glass. Lydia remained near the table, arms folded tightly over her chest, jaw clenched in a way that told me she was already rewriting the story in her head. I knew that look. It wasn't regret, it was calculation. Mom, Daniel said finally, his voice hoarse. Please, can we talk? I nodded. Of course, Lydia interrupted. There's nothing more to discuss. Daniel turned to her sharply. Yes, there is. That surprised her. Good. He faced me again. I need to understand how this went so wrong. I chose my words carefully. It went wrong the moment you believed someone else understood my life better than I did. Lydia scoffed. This is unfair. You made us believe you were helpless. I never said that, I replied calmly. You assumed it. She stepped forward because you lived like you had nothing. I smiled faintly, and yet you were perfectly comfortable taking it. That landed hard. Daniel closed his eyes. Lydia, he said quietly, you canceled my mother's card without telling her. It was necessary, she snapped. She was unstable. The word hung in the air like poison. Daniel's eyes snapped open. Unstable? You saw her tonight, Lydia continued. Dramatic, secretive, manipulative. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Daniel looked at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. No, he said slowly. What I saw tonight was my mother being patient, longer than anyone should have to be. Lydia laughed sharply. So now you're choosing her over me? I'm choosing truth, he replied. Silence followed. Then Lydia turned to me. You think you've won? She said coldly. But you've damaged this family. I met her gaze without flinching. You damaged it the moment you treated love like leverage. She stepped back, breathing hard. I will not raise my child around someone who undermines us, she said. That's your choice, I replied. Just as it was your choice to try and erase me. Daniel's voice cracked. Please stop. Lydia grabbed her coat. I'm leaving. She didn't look at Daniel when she said it. She walked out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house. Daniel sank onto the couch, head in his hands. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear I didn't know. I sat beside him. You knew something was wrong, I said gently. You just didn't want to see it. He nodded slowly. I thought protecting you meant controlling things, he admitted. I forgot you taught me how to stand on my own. We sat in silence for a long time. When I finally stood to leave, Daniel looked up at me, eyes red. Will you forgive me? He asked. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, I said. But it's a beginning. Outside, the air was cold and clear. For the first time since this began, I felt no fear of what came next, because the truth was out. And people who lose control don't always accept it quietly, but they can no longer pretend. Because what Lydia tried next away from witnesses proved just how dangerous entitlement becomes when it's exposed. Lydia didn't disappear after that night. She retreated. And retreat, I had learned long ago, is not the same as surrender. 3 days after Christmas, my phone rang just after sunrise. I knew it was her before I even looked at the screen. Some instincts don't fade with age, they sharpen. I let it ring, then again. Finally, I answered. Good morning, Lydia, I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, then her voice measured, controlled, almost polite. I think we need to talk privately. No, I replied. That surprised her. I'm calling because Daniel is confused, she continued, ignoring my answer. He's emotional. This situation has destabilized him. He's an adult, I said. He's allowed to feel. You manipulated him, she snapped. You waited until the perfect moment to turn everyone against me. I smiled faintly. You gave me the moment. I only stopped lying. Her breathing sharpened. You think money makes you untouchable? No, I said. Self-respect does. She changed tactics instantly. What about your grandson? She asked softly. Do you really want to damage that relationship before he's even born? There it was, the final card. I want him to grow up seeing truth, I replied. Not control disguised as love. You'll regret this, she said. I already regret something, I answered calmly. Letting this go on as long as I did. She hung up without another word. That same afternoon, Daniel came to see me. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, like someone who had aged years in days. She wants us to move, he said quietly, to put distance between you and everything. I nodded. And what do you want? He hesitated. I don't know. That honesty mattered. I won't fight you, I said, but I won't follow you into silence again. He swallowed. She says you'll try to control our child. I almost laughed but stopped myself. I controlled nothing, I said gently. I endured. Daniel looked at the floor. She's asking me to choose. I reached across the table and took his hand. Then choose wisely, I said. Not between people, but between patterns. He stayed a long time that day. We talked about his childhood, about the years I worked quietly while he slept, about the man he wanted to be. When he left, he hugged me tightly. I need time, he said. I know, I replied. That evening, I did something I should have done years earlier. I rewrote my will. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I ensured that no one could ever again assume entitlement to what I had built. Everything was documented, protected, transparent. Because trust without boundaries is just vulnerability waiting to be exploited. A week later, Daniel called. "She moved out," he said softly. I closed my eyes, not in relief, not in triumph, but in acceptance. "I'm sorry," he added, "for everything." "So am I said, "but we can still do better." That night, as I sat alone in my quiet home, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, freedom. Because the final lesson wasn't about money or power, but about what silence costs and what truth restores. The house was quiet again. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet I had lived with for months, but the peaceful kind. The kind that settles when something false has finally been removed. I woke early the morning after Daniel told me Lydia had moved out. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and patient, as if the world itself was giving me time to breathe. I made tea, sat at the table, and listened to the familiar sounds of my home. For the first time in a long while, nothing felt threatened. That afternoon, Daniel came by. No rehearsed speech, no defensiveness, no mediator standing between us, just my son. He looked different, lighter, despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, sitting across from me, "about what I let happen." I didn't interrupt. "I thought being strong meant taking control," he continued. "I thought responsibility meant deciding for others. But I see now. I confused love with authority." I nodded. "That's an easy mistake to make when fear is guiding you." He took a deep breath. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were." "They shouldn't," I replied gently. "Growth rarely moves backward." He smiled faintly. "But I'd like to move forward, with honesty." That was all I had wanted. Not obedience, not guilt, honesty. Weeks passed. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt something new. Our conversations changed. He asked instead of assuming, listened instead of managing. And I learned something too, that protecting someone doesn't mean disappearing for them. It means standing where they can truly see you. One evening, Daniel asked, "Do you regret hiding your success all those years?" I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said. "I regret staying silent after it stopped being helpful. Silence had saved me once, but later, it nearly erased me." That was the lesson. People often think strength looks like endurance, like swallowing discomfort to keep peace. But real strength is knowing when peace is costing you your dignity. I didn't reveal my truth to punish anyone. I revealed it to survive myself. And that changed everything. I now live openly, but not loudly. Secure, but not arrogant. Independent, but not isolated. The money I built was never the point. What mattered was ownership of my life, my choices, my voice. Sometimes, Daniel brings up his son, my grandson. He asks questions about the future, about values, about what kind of family he wants to build. I always give the same answer. Teach him respect before authority, and love without control. Because if this story proves anything, it's this. The most dangerous thing you can give away is not money. It's your silence. When people mistake your patience for permission, they will keep taking until there's nothing left. And the moment you finally speak, they'll call it dramatic. Let them. Truth doesn't need approval. It only needs courage. I spent years building an empire quietly, but the bravest thing I ever built was my voice. Silence can protect you, but only for a while. This story reminds us that kindness without boundaries becomes an invitation for control. When you keep shrinking to keep the peace, people don't learn to respect you. They learn how far they can go. Age does not erase wisdom. Patience does not mean weakness. And love does not give anyone the right to take away your dignity. The true danger isn't losing money, status, or comfort. It's losing your voice. Because the moment others start making decisions for you without listening, You stop being a person in their eyes and become a problem to manage. This story teaches us that respect must exist before care. Control disguised as love is still control. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are self-respect. Truth may come late, but it always arrives with power. And most importantly, you don't owe silence to anyone who benefits from it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to endure quietly. It's to stand up calmly and say, "You don't get to decide who I am." And this is why her story matters. Because sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people who believe they're helping. She didn't lose her strength with age. She didn't lose her mind. She didn't lose her worth. She only lost her silence. And the moment she spoke, everything changed. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, emotional, or reflective, then it wasn't just a story. It was a reminder. A reminder that respect should never be optional. That love should never feel like control. And that your voice still matters, no matter your age. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Do you think she did the right thing? Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that reveal hidden truths. And don't forget to check out the next story on your screen. You might be surprised how familiar it feels. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.